Well, good evening, sisters. It is really great to be back together again this evening. I hope you all had a wonderful Thanksgiving. I know we did over here. It was different, not being at my mom's house and getting to spend time with her, but we still were able to have a really great day. So Justin, our son Justin, has become quite the chef and the baker during this pandemic time, and he actually made the turkey. So that was kind of fun. Yes, many of you look very surprised. It was delicious. It was very moist and delicious. He's really figuring some things out there in the kitchen. So yeah, so we did that. I tried some new recipes from some dishes I got from Jane Cooper. Those were a huge hit. I thought if the only thing that's different is the fact that we're not at my mom's, this will be a really discouraging time. So let's throw some other different things in and try to make some new traditions and fun for ourselves. And that was great. Chris Donaldson dropped off a homemade sweet potato pie for us. That's my very first time ever having sweet potato pie. And I got to tell you, that brother can cook. That was delicious. So if you're craving pie, you know who to call. And then our landlord installed our new dishwasher just after Ryan finished washing all the dishes. But woohoo! It's wonderful. So it was a great Thanksgiving at the Painter House. And hopefully you have enjoyed our time going through the book of Esther, but we're going to close out that series tonight. We've looked at the overview of the book of Esther as a whole. We have gone in depth and really talked about the sovereignty of God within the book, even though his name isn't mentioned even once. His hand and his handiwork are all over the book of Esther. We took a treasure hunt through the Old Testament several weeks ago, and we uncovered the effects, the lasting effects of sin and the consequences of not completely obeying the Lord. And then finally, last week, we talked about lessons that we could learn from Esther herself. And so tonight, we're going to close out with some more lessons that we can learn from some other folks in the book of Esther, specifically being Mordecai and the Jews. So I have two little subsections for tonight. And the first section is on Mordecai, and I've entitled that Mordecai, a man of principle. So there's three things that we're going to pull out about our friend Mordecai here. And the first is that he loved and cared for Esther. And so, we say this relatively regularly, family love knows no bounds, right? Or family bonds know no bounds. And that definitely is true for Mordecai. So after his uncle and his aunt pass away, he took it upon himself to take in his cousin Esther and to look after her, to raise her basically as his own. And that's clearly a bond of love between the two of them. So in Esther chapter 2, I just want to look at a couple of passages as we march through each of these people tonight. But in Esther chapter 2, in verse 11, this is right after Esther is taken to the palace as King Xerxes is searching the empire for his new queen. And in verse 11, it says, every day he walked back and forth near the courtyard of the harem to find out how Esther was and what was happening to her. And, I can just picture him just pacing every day, just excitedly, expectantly, maybe even fearfully going and pacing and watching. What can he see? What can he hear? What can he learn about his beloved cousin and what she's going through during her time at the palace? And while I was thinking about this familial love and how it knows no bounds, it's not convenient. It couldn't have been convenient for him to go put himself out there and walk around and wait and hope for whatever it is that he was going to hear. But even before that, long before that, when Mordecai took Esther in, his life changed radically forever. He doesn't appear from the scriptures to have been married. He doesn't appear from the scriptures to have other children, yet he was willing to rearrange his entire life to take in his cousin and take care of her. and not just to take care of her, but to learn to take care of her, right? You know, all of you moms out there know firsthand how steep that learning curve is when you bring home your first child, don't you? You know, we try to prepare ourselves. I did my fair share of babysitting when I was a teenager, but that did not come close to preparing me for motherhood and all of the stages of motherhood. When women first get pregnant, many of us go out and buy books after books of parenting and lessons and ways to be a better mom and all of that, how to bring up your children, how to discipline your children. It's still never enough. Having a child changes your life in such a way that the new thing is people go on these baby moons now. That wasn't a thing when we had children, but they go to get that last bit of indulgence, that last bit of normalcy, if you will, before their lives are completely turned upside down, even in a good way, but it's never the same again after you bring your child home. And Mordecai, thinking of him, here's a man who's never raised children, who didn't spend 9 months preparing to raise a child, who just takes a child as a father. And he's not even a stay-at-home dad, right? He's got to figure out childcare. He's got to figure out meal prep from when he gets home from his work at the city gate. He's got to figure out how to get Esther to all of her after-school activities. Okay, maybe not those, but there were a lot that Mordecai had to learn to figure out for himself. And this kind of love not only, but it's not cheap either, is it? Not financially and not emotionally. Somehow I was under the impression when our children were young that once they got out of diapers, they would be a little cheaper. And so if any of you single people out there still have that feeling, no, they actually get more expensive with every passing day. We're now eating second lunch, second dinner as my son's growing through his teen years. They're more and more expensive. And certainly as hard as I thought that it was kissing their boo-boos when they would hurt themselves when they were young, for me, it's so much harder even because I can't kiss the emotional boo-boos of growing up. There's just sit back and I hurt and I watch and I pray. But for me, that kind of emotional investment, it is so challenging. And I'm sure it was as well for Mordecai. Not just on a personal note with the challenges of family and the emotional investment of family. You know, I know many of us have really struggled to find some silver linings during this pandemic. Many of us are trying to just find one thing to really be grateful for over these last 9 months. But somehow, for me, through this pandemic, God has brought me and my family a treasure that I never thought was possible. So for years, like 20 years, maybe even longer than that, my mom has said, all I really want is all of my girls to be together. And you would think that would not be so challenging since my mom only had 3 girls. But actually, it's been incredibly challenging for us because we just really didn't have a great relationship for the last 20 some years. And somehow, I don't know how to explain it except for the grace of God, that all changed in March. Out of the blue, we just started texting each other and calling each other, and we're on group texts. And I went to Pittsburgh to celebrate my sister's birthday, and we'd have several Skype times with my mom. And it's just been so encouraging and such a blessing from God. But the emotions behind those rekindled relationships, family relationships, they were really hard fought, but they're priceless. And I think the same for Mordecai. Those were hard fought years for him, but priceless. Point number 2 about Mordecai, this man of principle, is that Mordecai wouldn't bow. Mordecai wouldn't bow. In Esther chapter 3, verses 1 through 5, it says, after these events, so there's an assassination plot against the king, and that gets taken care of after that. After these events, King Xerxes honored Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, elevating him and giving him a seat of honor higher than that of all the other nobles. All the royal officials at the king's gate knelt down and paid honor to Haman, for the king had commanded this concerning him. But Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor. Then the royal officials at the king's gate asked Mordecai, "Why do you disobey the king's command?" Day after day they spoke to him, but he refused to comply. Therefore they told Mordecai about it to see whether Mordecai's behavior would be tolerated. Therefore they told Haman about it to see whether Mordecai's behavior would be tolerated, for he had told them he was a Jew. When Haman saw that Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor, he was enraged. And then continuing in chapter 5, verse 9, says, Haman went out that day, the day that he sealed the fate of the Jews. Haman went out that day and in high spirits. But when he saw Mordecai at the king's gate and observed that he neither rose nor showed fear in his presence, he was filled with rage against Mordecai. Now, we don't know why Mordecai refused to bow to Haman. The Bible doesn't tell us. We can make some guesses. Maybe he might have disliked Haman, or maybe he didn't respect Haman, so he wasn't going to bow to him. It might just have been simply a personal principle that he's not going to bow to another man. Or it could have been spiritually motivated, that he's not willing to bow down to anyone or anything other than God. I like to think that one, but we don't know. The scriptures don't tell us that. But we do know that for whatever reason, he refused. And he refused to be coerced. He refused to be bullied into betraying his conscience and his convictions. It didn't matter what happened, who spoke with him, how he was threatened. He remained a man of principle who would not bow. Even when Haman signed the death sentence for the Jews and throughout the entire Persian Empire, and Mordecai most likely knew he had to have something to do with that, had to have known that he's inciting Haman's hatred of the Jews and anger. It still didn't change his principle. He still didn't bow. He still didn't back down. Going back to Esther chapter 4, verse 1, it says, when Mordecai learned of all that had been done, that's the plot to kill all of the Jews, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the city wailing loudly and bitterly. And that's it. That's all he did. It didn't change his behavior. He put on sackcloth and ashes. He wept. But Haman's decision did not change his principle. He would not bow. And I think that's something very respectable about him, that his inability to be moved was something that he felt so deeply about. And finally, with Mordecai, number 3, do your job. Okay, so it's really hard to be married to Ryan Painter and not be a football fan, right? Well, I actually was a football fan before I married Ryan Painter, but I've learned some things from him, even as a football fan, during our time together. Actually, I learned something during our time in New England together, because otherwise I would never have watched the New England Patriots. Go Steelers, right? Don't hate me, Juanita. Okay. But anyhow, everyone in New England, if you've ever been to New England or met anyone from New England, you will know everyone in New England loves the New England Patriots, loves the New England Patriots, right? They're in the news all the time. They're in the newspapers all the time. They're talked about all the time, all year long. And their coach's name is Bill Belichick. Some of you might remember him because he was a coach of the Browns back in the early 90s. Probably all the more reason why Ryan doesn't like the Patriots, because they took the Browns football coach and he won up there. But anyhow, I digress. Bill Belichick is famous in New England for something that he says to each of his players every Sunday morning. Do your job. That's it. That's his famous tagline, do your job. And his philosophy is simply, if every player would go out on the field and simply focus on doing his job, they'll win the game. And they did. While we were up there, they won all the time. It was actually kind of infuriating. But everybody did their job and they got the job done. Good days or bad days, do your job. When you feel like it and when you don't feel like it, do your job. If you just had a fight with your wife on the way to the stadium, do your job. Whatever it is, do your job. And Mordecai, he might not have said it so eloquently, but Mordecai lived it, and he modeled that principle well for us. Let's go to Esther chapter 2, verse 19. So this is the conspiracy that we were alluding to earlier. Verse 19 says, when the virgins were assembled a second time, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. But Esther had kept secret her family background and nationality, just as Mordecai had told her to do. For she continued to follow Mordecai's instructions as she had done when he was bringing her up. During the time Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, became angry and conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. But Mordecai found out about the plot and told Queen Esther, who in turn reported it to the king, giving credit to Mordecai. And when the report was investigated and found to be true, the two officials were hanged on the gallows. All this was recorded in the book of the annals in the presence of the king. After these events, King Xerxes honored Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, elevating him and giving him a seat of honor. Let's move over to chapter 6, verse 1. This is after Esther's second dinner that she has for the king as she's trying to help him understand what is being done to the Jews. And so it says, that night, the king could not sleep. So he ordered the book of Chronicles, the record of his reign, to be brought in and read to him. It was found recorded there that Mordecai had exposed Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, who had conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. What honor and recognition has Mordecai received for this? The king asked. Nothing has been done for him. His attendants answered. Then the king asks, who's in the court and what should we do for them? And the answer he receives in verse 7 is, for the man the king delights to honor, have them bring a royal robe the king has worn and a horse the king has ridden, one with a royal crest placed on his head. Let the robe and horse be entrusted to one of the king's most noble princes. Let them robe the man the king delights to honor and lead him on the horse through the city streets, proclaiming before him, this is what is done for the man the king delights to honor. Go at once, the king commanded to Haman, get the robe and the horse and do just as you have suggested for Mordecai the Jew who sits at the king's gate. Do not neglect anything you've recommended. So Haman got the robe and the horse. He robed Mordecai, led him on the horse back through the city streets, proclaiming before him, this is what is done for the man the king delights to honor. Afterward, Mordecai returned to the king's gate. Amen. Wow. And actually, I was incorrect. That's the night between the two dinners that King Esther had for King Xerxes. But anyhow, the point is that Mordecai returned to the gate. He returned to work after he was ignored and unrewarded at the beginning when he exposed the plot to say and saved the king's life. No reward. What does he do? He goes back to the gate to do his job. Then he gets this amazing public honoring later in the book of Esther. And then what does he do when he's done? He goes back to the gate to do his job. Sisters, if we get overlooked for affirmation, or we get overlooked for a promotion, or whatever it is that we think we deserve and we didn't get it, let's just go do our jobs. Or maybe you do get elevated. Maybe you do get celebrated. Great, amen. But then go back and do your job. Sometimes we get the good side, sometimes we get the bad side, but regardless, I think Mordecai modeled that perfectly for us, that in the good and the bad, when we get what we deserve and when we don't, let's just go back and do our job. We can only find our significance in God. We can only find the satisfaction of our insatiable need to be noticed with God. And there alone, we're free to be neither depressed nor impressed with what anyone else in this world thinks of us. Let me read that last one again, because I think it's so important. There and there alone, with God, we are free to be neither depressed or impressed with what anyone else in this world thinks of us. Amen. Let's move on to the last portion. This evening, we're going to talk about God's people. God's people, and I've entitled this part, God's people trusted and honored God. Okay, so in Esther chapter 8, verse 11, the king gives Mordecai and Esther the opportunity to write a new edict. He can't cancel out the old edict, but lets them write a new edict so that they can defend themselves. That's where we pick this up in verse 11. It says, the king's edict granted the Jews in every city the right to assemble and protect themselves, to destroy, kill, and annihilate any armed force of any nationality or province that might attack them and their women and children, and to plunder the property of their enemies. The day appointed for the Jews to do this in all the provinces of King Xerxes was the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar. A copy of the text of the edict was to be issued as law in every province and made known to the people of every nationality, so that the Jews would be ready on that day to avenge themselves on their enemies. Okay. Do you notice the difference? And I know it's been a long time since we've read the other words. The difference between the verbiage in the first edict and this edict. On the one hand, they follow each other very closely. They talk about destroying, killing, and annihilating. But the difference is Haman's edict went out as an act of aggression. The next edict that went out, it wasn't vindictive. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't vindictive. It was protecting and defending the Jewish people. And the Jews really needed to trust God in that. When Mordecai and Esther wrote the new edict, they're given permission only to defend themselves. Now, to defend themselves to the point of death if necessary, but strictly to defend themselves. They were not given any permission to murder the Persians. And if you'll notice the difference between those two edicts, Haman's was to attack, Esther's to avenge. And even in the right to protect themselves, God's people didn't assume more authority or more responsibility than they were given. The loss of lives was limited to those who raised their hands against the Jews, and that's it. They were allowed to avenge, but they were not allowed to revenge, because the scriptures tell us that vengeance only belongs to God. And so they did. They protected themselves, and then they stopped there. Also, they didn't plunder the Persians. In chapter 9, verse 16, it says, meanwhile, the remainder of the Jews who were in the king's provinces also assembled to protect themselves and get relief from their enemies. They killed 75,000 of them, but did not lay their hands on the plunder. And that might not seem like a big deal to us, but that's a huge deal and definitely gives us some insight into the minds of the Jews at the time. They were given permission in the edict. God allowed Mordecai and Esther to write it. The king allowed the Jews to go ahead and plunder the people who tried to kill them. They were given that permission, but they didn't do it. And that actually goes back to our treasure hunt that we took several weeks ago that started in 1 Samuel 15. The Jews viewed this fight, this vengeance, this avenging of themselves, this defending of themselves, they viewed that as a spiritual fight, not a physical one. It wasn't personal, it was spiritual. And we can assume that because if you read through the Old Testament, God sometimes allows his people to plunder, and God sometimes doesn't allow his people to plunder. And the difference is if it's a spiritual war, if it's a spiritual purpose, accomplishing God's purposes, there is no plunder. If it's for God's people, there's plunder. And so the difference is here, the warriors weren't acting on their own behalf, but they were acting as agents of God's wrath, his wrath against the Amorites. If you remember that, we talked about that several weeks ago. And so they weren't entitled to the plunder. They might have been technically allowed, but they knew spiritually, they knew in their hearts, they weren't entitled to the plunder. And since the Jews didn't plunder, it's a strong indication that they viewed that time, that little mini war, that battle, as a continuation or a correction of the battle 600 years earlier with the Amalekites. I'm sorry, I misspoke again. With the Amalekites, not with the Amorites. What's going on with me tonight? Amen. Let's continue reading one more passage here about the people of God. In Esther chapter 9, verse 17, it says, "This happened on the 13th day of the month of Adar, and on the 14th day they rested and made it a day of feasting and joy. The Jews in Susa, however, had assembled on the 13th and 14th, and then on the 15th they rested and made it a day of feasting and joy. That is why rural Jews, those living in villages, observe the 14th of the month of Adar as a day of joy and feasting, a day for giving presents to each other." Mordecai recorded these events, and he sent letters to all the Jews throughout the provinces of King Xerxes, near and far, to have them celebrate annually the 14th and the 15th days of the month of Adar as the time when the Jews got relief from their enemies, and as the month when their sorrow was turned into joy and their mourning into a day of celebration. He wrote to them to observe the days as days of feasting and joy and giving presents of food to one another and gifts to the poor. Amen. The Jews didn't commemorate the day of their battle. They didn't commemorate the day of their victory in their battle, but they commemorated the day on which they rested. They rested from their enemies. They didn't make an anniversary of war. They made an anniversary of rest. They again celebrated and they commemorated the day the Lord gave them as a Sabbath. And it was a day that was set aside for joy, and joy that can only come from God. And I think it's so important for us to remember that as well, that true joy comes from God. True joy, we need to take that time to rest, to find our Sabbath, to celebrate, and to rejoice in God. So I hope that you've enjoyed our journey and our study through the book of Esther as much as I have. It definitely is one of my very favorite books of the Bible. It's one that I go to be reminded of God's sovereignty, to be strengthened in God's sovereignty. It definitely moves my heart in that way. There's great lessons on the cost and the consequences of not completely obeying God. And then lots of lessons that we can learn from the people along the way as they live their lives. Some of those good and some of those not good. But there's certainly a lot that we can learn from them throughout the book of Esther.